Is it working? Yeah? Because the light turned off. Oh. Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit today about our work. Don't know if I'm standing in the way. Towards the development of technology for improved, well, CTG acquisition, and our work to complement that with fetal electrocardiography. Well, first a disclaimer. So next to my affiliation at Eindhoven University of Technology, I'm also one of the founders and shareholder of Nemo Healthcare, so it's commercial activity, so that you are aware of that. To get everybody on the same page, probably everybody knows, but I just wanted to put it in because I'm the first. The cardiotocogram is typically a registration used in obstetrical wards to diagnose, well, progress of labor or the condition of the fetus. And it's about two signals, the fetal heart rate and uterine activity. Well, in my talk today, I will only focus on the fetal heart rate. We do some work on uterine activity as well, but that will not be the topic of my talk today. Well, the cardiotocogram, or the fetal heart rate in this case, how can you measure this in clinical practice? Well, basically, there are two methods. The external methods with a Doppler ultrasound probe, and the internal method with a scalp electron. Well, in our research, we focus on unobtrusive measurement of fetal heart rate. So for that reason, I'm not focusing on the internal and the scalp electrode, on external methods, and I'm going to complement the Doppler ultrasound with non-invasive fetal electrocardiography. But I actually will start first with our work on the Doppler ultrasound, because we're also working on that to improve Doppler ultrasound. Yeah, if you want to improve it, there should be a problem. Well, what is the problem? Well, Doppler ultrasound works at insonifying the fetal heart, so it's a narrow ultrasound beam. It's directed at the heart, so the heart is beating, and you get a clear signal. But what if the fetus is moving, or the maternal mother is moving, and the probe moves a little bit? Then you miss the fetal heart and you don't get any signal. So what happens? Sorry. So what happens in practice? Well, you lose information. Probably a nurse will go into the labor ward, reposition the probe, so there will be a disruption of workflow. Yeah, and you need to reposition, and you might have to do that plenty of times during one labor, during one delivery. So if you open up a transducer, so this is a Philips transducer, you see there are 7 elements, but they're actually all interconnected electronically, so they act as one. So they all insonify the heart, and they all listen to the reflected signal. So what we actually did, we disconnected it, and we hooked up each single element with a different mechanism, so we could drive every element independent with a varosonic system, so we could, well, use different elements, crystals, to insonify the fetus, could different ones to receive the signal. What we did first is do let's say more in silico study. Actually, sorry, there's an actual measurement. So here's one crystal. It was in a water tank, and we had a hydrophone, so basically a microphone that could listen to the sound, and you could see that the beam is spreading a little bit, and if you go deeper into, well, the water tank or the abdomen, you see that the intensity drops. So from that we generated a model. That's basically a model called here in phi that describes mathematically the ultrasound beam that we receive. So first we transmit, it reflects on the fetal heart on a moving surface, it comes back, and that's modeled with phi. And phi is then a function of the variable h, and h is the heart position. So where is the fetal heart? And the other variables are not that answering. This is attenuation and some random noise. So what we did then, if we have 7 different elements, well, each of these elements can receive a different signal. So we have a model with, well, 1 heart position, and we receive the power, the ultrasound power, in 7 positions. And then you can build a maximum likelihood model. Actually, what we did then is, well, if you know the heart position at time t is in one position, at time t plus 1, it should be virtually in the same position. So we extended the model with an inertia model, and in the end came with a maximum a posteriori solution in the form of an extended Kalman filter. It's not that interesting to understand exactly how it works. But then you can see in a simulation that the cross is the actual position, the circle is the actual position of the heart, and the cross is where we think it will be. So you can see when it's outside the grid, so these circles are the elements, then we can actually track the position of the heart fairly well. And actually this work was awarded with the Martin Black Award, so it's the best paper published in physiological measurements in the year 2017, so the award was recognized in 2018. It was by a PhD student in our group, Paul Hamelman. He's now with Philips Research. Well, next to in silico model, we also use an in vitro model. We couldn't use it in patients because the Verisonic system we used to drive the ultrasound is not a medically certified system, at least not the version that we have. So what we did, we built a water tank. It was a chicken heart, which was driven by a motor, so it would actually move around in the tank. And instead of moving the heart, we moved the ultrasound probe, so we could move it in a fixed, well, we could control it entirely. Here's a short movie. Well, actually, here you see, I will come back to that later, we have two motors, and there are actually two hearts in the tank. It's a study towards a twin. And you can also see that, oh, sorry, if you look again, we have a different ultrasound layout, so there are many elements. I will come back to that later on as well. So you can see the hearts are moving, trying to mimic the actual movement of a heart in the fetus. Of course, it's not entirely the same, but still we have a moving surface. And in this experiment, what we saw is here you have the elements, that the error, basically, as long as the heart is within the grid of the probe, the error is smaller than the spacing between the elements. So the spacing is 1 centimeter. What that basically means is that we are able to basically say in what part of the probe the fetal heart is. And if the fetus moves out of the ultrasound beam, we would be able to say in which direction it moves. So that can at least help the workflow, that it's not just random searching where is the heart, but there could be an indicator, for instance, saying the heart moved in that direction. Of course, what we would want is, for instance, to steer the beam so that there shouldn't be an intervention by a nurse, but that you could actually track the heart with the ultrasound. But unfortunately, the spacing of these elements is too wide, so we cannot electronically steer the beam. And of course, we can then decrease the size or make them smaller, closer together so that we can steer. But we decided to go with a slightly different approach. So here's again the 7 elements. But we decided, well, why not increase the number of elements? So if you don't drive all of them, you can still decide to only drive 7 of them. And so still insonify the heart with the same energy as you do normally. But then we can switch between them so we can follow the heart. So actually, this is an actual prototype. So it's a flexible silicone with CMOT transducers as a novel technology, so it's much cheaper to make these elements. And then we thought, why not use this on twins? Because twins is getting, well, more and more a problem in the sense, more women will decide to have childbirth at a higher age, and they often need assisted reproductive technologies, for instance, IVF. So you see an increase in the twins, as you can all see in this graph. And typically twins have a lower weight, and they have more complications. So it's relevant to monitor them. And that's, with the current technology, it's fairly difficult to monitor them. For instance, ideally you would have 2 transducers. A lot of setups have 2 transducers. And in this way, well, you can see this transducer is directed at that twin, that one at that. This will be fine. But problems can occur. For instance, this probe picks up this heart and this heart. So it receives information from 2 signals from 2 hearts. Basically doesn't know what the fetal heart rate is. So this will already lead to problems. Another problem is they can all both insonify the same heart. So they measure the same heart rate. Well, the CTG device is typically equipped with an alarm that says if you have the same heart rate, probably you're monitoring the same fetus twice. So you at least know that you're missing one. But what if you're catching both, but by accident they have the same heart rate? Then basically the alarm is there and you don't know if you're monitoring one of them or both of them. And another problem can of course be that the fetus moves, or there can be an artery of the mother in between that's pulsating and you might catch the wrong signal. So a lot of problems. So our solution is basically, why not insonify the entire area and then do multi-depth. Basically what you do, you send in a signal and you wait a certain time period where you listen to the received signal. And that time basically determines how deep you are listening. And because we know at what speed sound propagates through, well, water-like tissues, you can basically determine the depth of where you're listening. So you can listen at every single depth. So that's what we did. Well, first one thing to show you, of course, the abdomen, if you have a large array, it's curved. So we have to curve our array as well. So you can see that these beams are more focused to one spot. So actually we're not insonifying everything, but still the idea was we are insonifying most of the uterus. And here you can actually then in an experimental setting see that a different depth where the Doppler signal was received from. So you can actually see in the twin study, so this is with the chicken hearts in the tank, that we actually see that there's one heart here, one heart there. So also have in time, so you can actually see the movement of the heart. So this is where we receive signals from. And then for the very easy clustering algorithm, we can actually say, well, there's 2 hearts here because we knew it was twin. And then the clustering algorithm will determine that one heart should be there, one should be there. And that way we can actually monitor both heart rates with one huge array. So this was what we let the motors do. So this was the heart rate that we induced with the on the chicken heart. So you can see that this was actually, well, working fairly well. So that's basically what we did with ultrasound. But if you then look at what does ultrasound do in clinical practice, well, these are numbers from a study from Wayne Cohen. Says that the success rate of ultrasound is, let's say, 83%. What does it mean? 83% of the time that you're monitoring, you get a heart rate. I hope that I showed you that with our innovation, we think we can boost this success rate. So we'll have less disruption of workflow. So probably in the end, the success rate can go up. What's more important is the positive percent agreement. That means that the time that the monitor, the CTG monitor, gives a heart rate, and you compare it to the gold standard scalp electrode, it's only 70% of time it's actually correct. And correct meaning it's less than 10% off. So a heart rate of 140, we would say everything between 126 and 154 is accurate, and then still it has almost, well, 27% of the time it's off. So it's giving heart rates that are, well, don't have any physiologically, they would make sense, but they are completely off. So our other effort is how can we improve that? We started that already in 2005, I should actually say 2004, when I started my graduation project in Eindhoven University. And we had this huge trolley, well, there was a huge trolley underneath with a lot of equipment, and with that we could measure, well, we placed electrodes in the abdomen, you can see that here, with a lot of cables, and we measured the fetal ECG, the uterine activity, maternal heart rate. Well, somewhat later we at least managed to get rid of that huge trolley and had a panel PC that even did a little bit of the processing on the spot. Still had separate electrodes. Over the years we went to one bigger electrode but still a cable to a device. And very recently we had one electrode patch with wireless communication between this pod basically and this device, and that's now being commercialized. But if you then measure such a signal, so fetal ECG on the abdomen, this is typically one of the signals we do receive. So you can see there's not much to see here. But we can do some basic filtering, get rid of power line interference, or some high frequency noise. We're actually injecting some signals to do continuous impedance measurements. And then we get a signal that looks like this, but this is the ECG of the mother, so not of the fetus. So it's still challenging to say something about fetal heart rate. So as a next step, we can suppress maternal ECG. Well, I actually, on purpose, picked up a very poor signal. Typically we have much higher quality that you can actually see the peaks already here, but let's also show an example of a signal that's not that great. So you can see it here. Well, very difficult to find fetal heart rate, of course. But luckily, we have more than one electrode. So this is the signal from one electrode, but we have more of them. So why not combine them in a smart way? And then you can get a signal that looks like this. Still a little bit difficult to see, but of course, well, we can use our fetal heart peak detection methods that have been published by Guy Warmerdam, and then you can see these red dots. That's why we find the heart rate. Well, this has been validated very thoroughly. These are correct. We checked this. This measurement was done simultaneously with the scalp electrode. So in fact, these are correct. But as you can see, it's still challenging. Still, these are peaks with all this processing and all the multi-channel combination. The peaks are very close to the noise level. So if you increase the noise level just a little bit, it will be extremely challenging. And that's, for instance, something we are dealing with in the Vullings casiosa period. When the fetal ECG, the amplitude drops because of the insulating layer, well, the noise doesn't drop. And then the peaks can be too small, and then we have still some challenges, although we managed to improve performance pretty well over the years. And if we do that, so fetal heart rate, we can have an electrophysiologically determined CTG, so fetal heart rate determined from our electrodes. This is one example. I have another example. It's also fetal heart rate, but here we also determine the uterine activity with exactly the same electrodes. We pick up the electrical activity of the uterus anyhow, so why not also translate that to uterine activity? I said, not part of the talk today, and it's mostly work of a former colleague of mine. And here another example. In red, you can see the fetal heart rate or the CTG from the non-invasive electrode. In blue, you see a simultaneously recorded scalp electrode fetal heart rate. And they are fairly accurate, well, fairly. If you remember the success rate and positive percent agreement of the Doppler ultrasound, the success rate was improved, so close to 90%. And the most problem where these 10% is mostly is during active pushing. We still have some challenges there, that the interference becomes that large that we We are working on to get the fetal heart rate there, but at this moment, that's where we lose the 10% mostly. And the positive percent agreement, so every time we give a heart rate, it's fairly accurate. Actually, we had a few incidences where the scalp electrode set a heart rate of 40, which probably was not correct, but still we had to say that we were incorrect because that was our gold standard. So I have one short movie. So how did we commercialize this technology? So the device. So that's the Nemo healthcare part of my presentation. I will run the movie so you can see how it works in clinical practice. So it's one patch. There will be a very small abrasion of dead skin cells. That's very mildly. So as you can see, it's wireless, and there are two of these spots there that in case a battery would drain, you can do a hot swap and it would continue monitoring. Although these batteries should last for between 28 and 30 hours, I think. So I think this is the last screen, so you can see we monitor heart rate of the mother, heart rate of the fetus, and the uterine activity. So let's say I've now discussed our work towards CTG acquisition. So let's assume it's now working always perfectly. Here an example. So this is actually from a scalp electrode. You can see this is a stance, so there are the TQS ratios. And I have more or less a question to the doctors in the room. So there are no ST events in this tracing whatsoever. I don't know anything about the history of this patient. But if you would see this CTG tracing, what would you do? See Joe go, nothing. Yeah. But in this case, 25 minutes later, they did an emergency cesarean section and they shot at a low pH, maybe not that low, a high base deficit. If you would know this, would you do an intervention then at that point? Yeah, I know. Of course. Yeah, I use this just as an example to say, CTG alone might not give the entire picture. So ideally, you would want more information. And I know there will be a lot of talks about, let's say, computerized algorithms that can try to extract more information from the CTG. So I'm going in a different direction because a lot of people know a lot more about that than I do. So I'm going to focus on the fetal ECG because with the measurements, the electrodes, we measure the fetal ECG. So why not exploit that? Probably you already know, I already mentioned it, the STAM monitor. So ST segment should reveal something about hypoxia. So why not see if we can use non-invasive fetal ECG to also do ST analysis or maybe the PR interval. There has been some relatively promising studies before on that. So you can also consider, can we say something about congenital heart disease? Because in heart disease, probably the ECG waveform will look abnormal. Intrauterine growth restriction might also carry some information there, but that is under the assumption that if the fetus is small, also the heart is small. I have one doctor tell me that for a small fetus with growth restriction, typically the heart has normal size, so that would ruin this idea probably. But since for double ultrasound, I mentioned something about twin monitoring, why not see if we can use the fetal ECG as well for twin monitoring? So I'm going to talk about these two in boldface, so congenital heart disease and twin monitoring. But if we want to use fetal ECG, you saw before, quality is still pretty low. We could find the heart rate, but yeah, that quality is difficult to say something about, for instance, congenital heart disease. So I took another example. So this is a fetal ECG signal. So the maternal ECG has been removed. We did some basic filtering. That's what we're left with. Yeah, it will be very difficult to say something. So we need additional monitoring. So I've worked in quite a few years ago on an adaptive Kalman filter that could do a decent job. Over the years, we also developed a time sequence adaptive filter that's done by Eleni Fortiano, who's also here today. And for instance, that filter would give a result that looks like this. You can already see these peaks are much more clear. There's still noise there, but it's already better than what we have there. Eleni is at this moment also working on encoder, decoder neural networks, so deep learning or artificial intelligence, so you like. And then from the same signal, we can get a signal that looks like this. You can see the quality has improved dramatically, although here, the amplitude has decreased, which shouldn't be. So we're still working on that, but there's a lot of promise in this technology, so we're trying to push that further. So to make my point clear, so this is something we're working on, a lot of promise, but my next results will be based on this signal. So the time sequence adaptive filter, where we thoroughly validated everything. Yeah, congenital heart disease, you might wonder this, this workshop is about monitoring in labor. Well, typically you detect congenital heart disease earlier in pregnancy, so why is it relevant for a workshop on monitoring in labor? Well, to start with, congenital heart disease happen about, well, let's say 1% of the time, so more or less the same as asphyxia. And of these children with congenital heart disease, almost 5% die in utero and more than 20% die after birth. And detection is typically done with prenatal ultrasound screening, an ultrasound examination at 20 weeks gestation. And the best countries in the world have a detection rate of severe congenital heart disease of between 40 and 60%, which means that almost half of severe congenital heart disease is missed in this screening. And if you have correct diagnosis of congenital heart disease, you can have better management of labor. And this picture is there on purpose. This is in a referral center where they knew a baby was going to be born with a severe congenital heart disease that would need immediate cardiovascular surgery after birth. So the entire staff is waiting to transport the baby after delivery to the right operating theater to do immediate surgery there. And it has been proved that the survival rates can be increased and long-term morbidity can be decreased if you know timely that there is congenital heart disease. So it's also very relevant for monitoring in labor, so that you know that you are dealing with a baby that has heart disease. Well, let's say for adults, for us, if we would have a heart disease, typically the first thing a doctor would do, a cardiologist would do, is take the 12-lead ECG. So it's 12 different leads, so lead 1, lead 2, lead 3, that's the Eindhoven lead. Not Eindhoven, the city where we're from, it's spelled different, but still Willem Eindhoven was from the Netherlands, and he won the Nobel Prize for this technology. But what this actually means is you look at the heart from different angles, and it gives the cardiologist can combine this in his or her head to come up with a complete picture of the heart and then say something about heart disease, yes or no, and probably also what kind of heart disease. So we have multiple electrodes, so we're also looking at the fetal heart from different orientation, from different directions. So here you can actually see it. So for instance, this one has the QRS in a positive deflection, here is negative, and that's because they are looking at the heart from a different orientation. So what we did is, well, it's difficult to process this, so why not combine everything through a three-dimensional electrocardiogram, or vector cardiograms if you like. So this is the vector cardiogram, and there's been some theories, or actually I should say studies, that in an adult, the vector cardiogram explains for 90% of the electrical activity of the heart. I would argue that for the fetus, it would explain for even more. And the reason being that we measured the ECG already from quite a distance with a very small heart. So the whole superposition theorem, so that's something from engineering, from physics, I should say, that for the adult heart, well, applies for 90%, for the fetal heart in our measurement setting would apply for close to 100%. So this is everything more or less that we can measure from the heart. So we have the vector cardiogram, and that's related to the heart in the way that if the heart would rotate, the vector cardiogram would rotate together with it. And that's facing us with a problem, because we place the electrodes on the abdomen, and the fetus is of course free to move around. And at 20 weeks gestation, they will move around a lot. So that's a challenge. So what we did, if you would track this over time, the vector cardiogram, you can see here that red and black are two successive heartbeats. You see the vector cardiogram. And here they are virtually the same. And we saw with ultrasound that at this moment the fetus was also not moving. This is exactly the same fetus a little later, and you can see that this vector cardiogram has rotated in space. And this coincided with, as you can imagine, with fetal movement. So the fetus was moving at thorax, so the heart was rotating. But actually, if you measure, well, this, it's not that difficult to then determine what kind of rotation was there. And if you know what kind of rotation was there, you can also mathematically correct for it. So that way we can compensate for fetal movement. And in fact, as I said, we did the ultrasound to confirm that the fetus was moving. Well, it's then also not that difficult if you have the ultrasound to say what was the orientation of the fetus at a point in time. And if you are rotating between heartbeats, why not rotate the entire fetus so that they are all in the same position? So normalize for the fetal orientation. So that's what we did. So basically that gives us the opportunity to get a fetal vector cardiogram for every fetus normalized for their orientation. To draw an analogy, that would basically be if you would place the electrodes directly on the fetal body. So actually we are not dependent on fetal movement anymore. And if we have the electrocardiogram, why not try to calculate the 12-lead ECG? Well, the engineers here will probably say, why would you do that? You have only three-dimensional information. You go to 12, that's complete nonsense. The information is not there. There's only three-dimensional. Yeah, that's exactly correct. But the cardiologists I'm working with, they cannot interpret a three-dimensional signal. They like the 12-lead ECG. They can have a look at the screen and immediately say what's going on. So that's what we did. We calculate 12-lead ECG. So I have one example here. So this is Eindhoven lead 1. So it's from the right shoulder to the left. And this is the fetal ECG complex of 126 healthy fetuses. So every line is one fetus. By now we have over 300 of these healthy fetuses. Well, and that doesn't change these results. We're in the process of publishing it. I wanted to update these figures, but my server is down, so I cannot access my data at this moment. So we have to do with the old picture. But so we have a fetal ECG for 126. So what we did then is calculate the median fetal ECG. So this is the median over 126 fetuses with an interquartile range. I hope you can see it. It's the pinkish area surrounding it. You can see they're all more or less behaving the same way. And what we can then do is calculate the full 12-lead ECG. So that every lead here is the median over these 120 fetuses. And well, we presented this to a cardiologist, and she was very happy because she said, this is exactly what I would expect. And I want to highlight two leads here. So lead 1, as I said, that's from right to left shoulder. Well, that's negative, which means that the main electrical activity is towards the right, which is already opposite from an adult. AVF, so that's from top to bottom. That's positive, so it means it's pointing downwards. So basically, you can say the main electrical activity of the fetal heart is towards the right ventricle. And that's what we would expect, because with for an adult, it's towards the left, because our left ventricle has a larger workload, because that has to push the blood into the aorta. For the fetus, it has a different circulation, and actually there we know from studies that the right ventricle has the most of the workload. So exactly what we would expect. So heart axis towards the bottom right. We also did a measurement in a fetus with an atrioventricular septal defect. As you can see, lead 1 is now turned positive, lead 1 is negative, which means to the upper right. Exactly what the pediatric cardiologist would expect. So this is still, it's not diagnosis in any way, because we first determine ECG. The cardiologist already knows what is the condition and just looks whether it is the ECG is what we would expect. So it's more a feasibility study. But this still requires a lot of human analysis. What I did then is, can we use artificial intelligence? And I know Antonia will explain a little bit about convolutional neural networks later, so I will skip. What I did is feed a neural network, so basically a complex computer algorithm with a fetal ECG. Actually, I should say the fetal vector cardiogram, the 3 leads. And the network had one task is say, is this a congenital heart disease or a healthy fetus? So no differential diagnosis, only is there something wrong, yes or no. We used 463 recordings, 324 of them were healthy. I had a doctor first select 100 of them that I couldn't see beforehand. We used them for testing the network. 50 of them were healthy, 50 of them had congenital heart disease, and the entire spectrum of heart disease was covered. So transposition of the great arteries, the AVSDs, the VSDs, totality of flow, everything was in there. So I trained the network on these 363. First we had to process, of course, everything. We could use 98% of the recordings at sufficient quality to find the fetal ECG with sufficient quality. One was lost in the test group, so we had 99 to test. There were 7 lost in the training set. What I did then is, because we have an unbalance in our training set, so in the test set they are 50-50, in the training they are not. So what I did is augment my data set. Did that for 2 reasons. So what I did is we have the vector cardiogram and just go as random rotations in 3-dimensional space. That would mean that I could randomize, do more rotations for the congenital heart disease, so increase that data set so that they were balanced. The other thing is my data set is fairly small, and there could be an association that, for instance, that the fetuses with congenital heart disease were more in breech position just by coincidence. And in this small data set, well, that can still be like that. So I wanted to dissociate the congenital heart, vector cardiogram or congenital heart disease from the orientation. So adding random rotations would help there. And then here you have an ROC plot. So what you can see is that with an accuracy of 72%, we could say whether an ECG came from a fetus with congenital heart disease or whether it was healthy. basically the conclusion of this part is that with non-invasive fetal ECG, it is possible to say something about the presence of congenital heart disease. We achieve a higher accuracy than conventional screening, which was between 40 and 60%. I put it already between these, what is it? Not parentheses, well, you know what I mean, quotation marks. Because in our current data set, it's not better at all, because our congenital heart disease was selected based on ultrasound. So actually, ultrasound performed achieved 100% accuracy in this data set. So our next step is to do this more in a blinded study where we do not know beforehand if there's heart disease, yes or no. And as said, no differential diagnosis in this study, also part of future research, but still I want to paint one picture. I once did a measurement at 24 weeks gestation, and I found this fetal ECG. This fetus had already undergone the prenatal screening where nothing was found. And to me, this looked a little bit strange. I can share information. It was my own son when he was, well, when my wife was pregnant. So this looked strange. I thought, okay, I'm working with pediatric cardiologists. Why not explore that? So I sent it to two of them without telling them. And one said, well, it looks innocent. And the other said, this is, I think it's an incomplete bundle branch block. And at 2 years after birth, he was diagnosed with an incomplete bundle branch block. So at 24 weeks, the cardiologist managed to do an accurate diagnosis, a differential diagnosis of a heart disease. I can say it's the main criticism we got when we published this, it's published in BMG case reports, is that the review said, well, this is not really a heart disease. It's very, very harmless. So why not focus on the very, well, the severe heart diseases? I fully agree, but in this case, I was very happy to hear him say that it's very harmless. So last part of my presentation, fetal ECG in twins. Well, why can multi-lead ECG help? The idea is if the hearts are in the same, well, probably not in the same orientation, so the ECG form per lead should be different. As well, probably one fetus is on one side, one fetus will be on one side, the other one will be on the other side. So different electrodes will record ECG with different amplitudes. So we did a measurement in twin. Actually, we did a few. So this is one example. So this is a signal from the electrode here in the bottom. So this is ECG of the mother. If we remove that, you can see this electrical signal. And you can see there are these peaks pointing upwards and there are these peaks pointing downwards. And they are from different fetuses. It's easy to say, but if we look at the other channels that are surrounding it, you can actually see that here the peaks coincide with the ones pointing downwards, and here they coincide with the one pointing upwards. So indeed, there should be one fetus on this side, one fetus on that side. And you can easily, well, if you combine the multi-channel information, it's not that difficult to separate them. So we could indeed make a CTG of this twin. Later on, I learned that the one in blue was a girl, the one in red was a boy. Didn't matter, of course, but it was nice to put it in the presentation. But of course, we can also then look at different leads and look at the ECG to see if I was right with my hypothesis. And indeed, what you can see if you look at this lead, well, one fetus has a much larger amplitude because, well, the fetus is close to that electrode. And for the other electrode, it's the other one that has a large amplitude. And indeed, between different electrodes, the waveform is different. So not only amplitude scaling, but also the ECG has a different waveform. And of course, we can then also make the three-dimensional sort of electrocardiogram of this electrical activity. So here you can see the two. So you can also see that they are in a different orientation. So my final thing that I did is assuming that they have a healthy heart. So I know what was the orientation of the electrocardiogram. So I placed the heart in this painting, basically. So I came up with these rough estimates of the orientation. I was actually, well, it's not a validation in any ways, but the ultrasound in the end confirmed that they were exactly in these orientations. So it was basically a very nice finding, but not validating anything because it was only the assumption that they were both healthy. So to conclude, I think CTG acquisition can be made more robust or more comfortable with either innovation in ultrasound technology, there's still a lot we can gain there, or with non-invasive fetal ECG. Well, with non-invasive ECG that provides extra information with the potential to say more about the condition of the child, for instance about the presence of heart disease, or in case that you're monitoring twins. But of course, it might also add value in non-invasive ST analysis. We have not worked on that yet, but should be part of our studies in the coming years. And last point that I think there's a lot of promise in the use of neural networks for instance, denoising the fetal ECG. But because with a neural network, it's simply a black box, so we don't know exactly how it works. And in my opinion, it requires much more thoroughly validation than methods that you already understand how they work. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to extend my special thanks to a few of my PhD students who did most of the work that I presented today.
Very interesting. I can't believe, every spa workshop you give a talk, and every time it's more interesting to me. So it's not repetitive, really.
Yeah, I try to change the content in it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, questions, comments?
I think I'm still playing from New York, a newbie. I can yell, or I should use
it's better to get on the recording.
I stand up.
Thank you.
Again, thank you so much. How do you? Use these.
At this moment, not non-malady certified answers. I choose the patient. He's now moved completely to false. He will be sent. But I just don't know. But I hope they will bring it further. How long the time series we were that we gave to the neural net? So one question: do you mean for the congenital heart disease or for the denoising? Okay, for the heart disease, we just gave it one heartbeat. Well, that's not exactly correct. What I should say. What I did is for every recording. So a recording typically lasted for about 20 minutes. And I used, well, basically I selected from that recording a few heartbeats. So it's just one ECG at a time. But then I think with a spacing of a few minutes. So typically I gave about 7 or 8 ECGs of the same fetus to the neural net. And didn't tell the neural net that they were from the same fetus. Of course, I managed, well, for sure did not include those in the testing set, also in the training set. So they were separated entirely. That's why I also experimented with these ROC plots. Is basically what I experimented with is, for instance, if you give 9 ECGs of one fetus to the neural net, it can come up with 9 different diagnoses as well. So I used majority voting, or also a case where just if one of them is labeled as CHD, then it's CHD. So I tried both, but the best result I got was majority. Well, no, actually, it was a threshold, I think, that if 2 out of 9 is CHD, then it's most accurate.
Thank you, Rick, as usually. Maybe I missed the point. Is there any relationship between gestational age and the quality of the signal that you can obtain by your method? The second question is about the possible measurement of ST and PR intervals. Very interesting, but if the situation with the noise and the quality of the fetal ECG is as you described so well, I wonder if it's a real, a possible direction.
Yeah, what we see is that the quality, say at 20 weeks gestation is, well, not perfect, but let's say as good as it can get. Well, yeah, before the heart is, of course, small, the heart is growing, so the signal from the heart will be stronger and stronger. But we will see a drop somewhere when the pharynx caseosa starts to appear, so around 28 weeks. So that will be electrically insulating, but after about 34 weeks, there should be gaps in the pharynx caseosa again. These gaps allow for proper signal propagation. So then the quality improves. Of course, we lose that spatial effect a little bit because these gaps, well, they are gaps, so the layer does not disappear. So it will be challenging if you would use electrocardiogram for congenital heart disease. But again, we are aiming for 20 weeks, so again, we're lucky. Towards the end, I would say the quality improves quite a lot. So I still think that, for instance, ST analysis will, well, noise for sure will be part of the challenge, but also how to deal with these movements, because the fetus moves, well, the ECG will move and we can track it, but can we track it accurately enough to also monitor variations in the ST segment, which with the stun, very small variations can already lead to an alarm, yes or no. So we have to be very accurate in that. And well, we haven't started the study, so I cannot answer it. PR interval, I know there's, well, there were some studies before that were very promising, and there was a bigger study that showed there was no value there. I've talked with Karel Rosen about from the stun monitor who had ideas why it didn't work, and I actually think that if those ideas are right, we can solve it. And then the PR interval is more interesting because you can determine that much more robust than the ST segment. So for sure, I will not